The SEC's having a real tough one right now because for the second straight year, they've watched a national championship game take place without one of its representatives. And when you've built your whole personality, your whole brand identity on dominating the college football world, and you get to the biggest stage and you are not there, it's a hard pill to swallow. It's a hard pill to deal with. Because for a really long time, and at times, deservedly so, the SEC has beat their chest about how they are better than everybody else. It just means more. Things are more difficult in the Southeastern Conference on the gridiron than everywhere else in America. And the results at times bore that out, where you'd have two teams from the SEC play in the national championship. Or you'd have two teams make the 4-team college football playoff. And for year after year after year after year, barring a win from Florida State, Clemson, and Ohio State here, the SEC won the national championship over and over and over again. But 2 consecutive years, that hasn't been the case. Now, I don't want to sit here and argue about whether or not the Big Ten has surpassed the SEC, because I think those kind of conversations are a moot point and are generally pointless. Because at the end of the day, to me, the idea of conference superiority feels like a coping mechanism. Because I don't get the impression that LSU, Georgia, Alabama, I don't get the impression that they are the schools chanting SEC, SEC. To me, it's the rallying cry for schools like Missouri and Texas A&M and Mississippi State and Kentucky and South Carolina, that rather than confront the fact of like, why aren't we as good as we think we should be, as we think we deserve to be? Why do we continue to fall short of what our aspirations are? And when that's the question, it's much easier to go, well, holy hell, it's just so hard in this conference to be good. And we don't have it as easy as they got it in the ACC or the Big 10 or the Big 12. We got to work for it. And my God, when you're going up against these 10,000-pound gorillas, we just can't knock those guys off. Rather than say, yeah, we're just not as good. Our job's not as attractive to top-tier coaches. Our football program isn't as attractive to top-tier recruits. Our fan base isn't big enough to sustain the NIL opportunities needed, isn't big enough to support the finances needed to have the most badass facilities. Our recruiting base isn't as good as other places. It's much easier to just sit down and go, well, God, our conference is so hard, we're never going to be able to get ahead. So instead of demanding more or doing whatever it takes to invest in our program, whether it be emotionally, financially, etc., I'll just sit here and bitch about it. It's a lot easier to do that. If given the opportunity to complain or work really hard, there are a lot of people who will choose complain. And so I don't get the impression that the conference superiority matters all that much to the Georgias, Alabamas, LSUs, Texas, Oklahomas, Floridas, of Tennessees, of the SEC, because they are battling for program superiority at the upper echelons of college football. Alabama and LSU and Georgia are fighting Ohio State and Notre Dame and USC and Clemson for which program is better. Because when you start going through the pecking order there, especially for recruits, that matters. But if you start arguing about which conference is better, it's because Missouri and Kentucky and South Carolina and Vanderbilt and Mississippi State don't really have a leg to stand on other than those 3 letters sewn onto their chest. And so when they can combine their resources, pool their arguments against the Illinois, Maryland, Rutgers, Northwesterns of the world, the Boston College, Georgia Techs, Texas Techs, Oklahoma States of the world, that gives them a leg up on that competition because those schools in the SEC that I mentioned, your Missouri, Kentucky, South Carolina, Mississippi State, etc., they're very likely never to be A-tier programs in the SEC. They're just not. They have competitive disadvantages that LSU and Alabama and Georgia and Florida and Texas and Oklahoma don't have. But they can out-recruit the Illinois, Northwesterns, Texas Techs, Baylors of the world when you say you can come here and you can play in the SEC, the best conference in America. And when you just tell people over and over again that you are the best, people inevitably believe you. And they had no reason not to believe the SEC for a really long time because they were successful time after time after time. When push came to shove and it was SEC versus somebody else in a national championship game, more often than not, SEC won. Until they didn't. And it's okay that they didn't. But the idea that even as recent as 8 weeks ago, there are prominent people saying, don't put Ohio State in the playoff. Put South Carolina. Put Ole Miss in the playoff. South Carolina is the hottest team in the country. They deserve a playoff spot over Ohio State, who we just saw lost to a bad Michigan team. South Carolina lost their bowl game to freaking Illinois. And Ohio State won the national championship, doing it for the most part in dominating fashion. There was nobody as impressive in the college football playoff as Ohio State, as evidenced by the idea that they take home the big gold trophy that everybody wants. I think the idea that simply because we have a little circle right here on our chest that says SEC means we are the better of the two opponents in whatever game has gone by the wayside. And I think that's an undeniably good thing. When you get to a point where teams are judged by their resume, are judged by their talent level, are judged by what they have accomplished rather than by who they are associated with, I think that's a good thing for the sport. There's a term in like scouting for the NFL draft that you are scouting the helmet and not the player, right? That the idea that if you were to put two players directly beside each other and one has their numbers on the side of the helmet from Alabama and the other goes to Alabama State, that you're automatically going to assume that the player from Alabama is better because he went to Alabama. And that's not always the case. And the SEC has benefited from that for a really long time. That because they have the letters SEC sewn onto their chest, they are the better of the two programs in whatever metric you want to use on the football field. And you've seen that go away. Ohio State beat two SEC teams in the college football playoff. The SEC champ lost its first game. Things did not go well for that conference in the postseason. And you can make all the excuses you'd like. You can say South Carolina was disappointed. They didn't make the playoffs, so they played like hell against Illinois and got beat. You can say that Ole Miss, you can hang your hat that Ole Miss beat the piss out of Duke in a bowl game. You can make whatever excuses you want or point to whatever you can say to try to reinforce your argument that the SEC is still a dominant conference in college football and they haven't been surpassed. One, I don't think we should care about conference supremacy. I don't think it should matter outside of when you're putting together the college football playoff. Does it matter? I think the idea that like because you finished in 5th place in the SEC, that makes you better than the 2nd place team in the Big 12 is stupid. I think teams should be judged on a team-by-team basis rather than the SEC was so much better than the Big 10, or in this case, the Big 10 was so much better than the SEC that the 6th place team in the Big 10, I don't want to be in that spot. I want to judge teams against other teams. I don't want to judge conference versus conference because I don't think that's a good way to decide who the best teams are. And when that's the ultimate goal, why would you prioritize anything else? Those are just my thoughts. I want to hear yours in the comments down below. You think the Big 10 is better than the SEC right now? Let me know. Drop me a line and let's have that conversation. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content we're pumping out. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. I'll see you tomorrow for another episode of the Daily Huddle.